ABC News exclusive, a unique look inside Camelot. The story is told by the First Lady about her husband, the President. The details are in those never-before-released tapes made by Jacqueline Kennedy just 4 months after John F. Kennedy's assassination.
For most of the 20th century, Jacqueline Kennedy stood as the picture of composure. She was the widow who walked behind a caisson without flinching, the woman in the pink suit who refused to change her clothes so the world could see what violence had done to her family. But composure is not the same as peace. And for decades, the men whose job it was to stand 3 feet behind her carried a version of her story that never reached the public. 2 of those men, Clint Hill and Paul Landis, spent the rest of their lives choosing silence over profit. When they finally spoke, what they described was not a scandal in the tabloid sense. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more devastating. A woman who spent 30 years running from a single afternoon in Dallas, and 2 agents who never stopped running with her. Jacqueline Bouvier was working as a photographer for a Washington newspaper when she met a young congressman with a famous last name and an easy charm. They married in 1953 in a wedding that dominated the society pages. And 8 years later, her husband was sworn in as the 35th President of the United States. She arrived at the White House at 31 years old with 2 small children, a distaste for public attention, and an open resentment toward the Secret Service detail she considered an intrusion on the little private life she had left. She had not asked for a permanent guard and made her irritation known. The agent given the assignment anyway was a young North Dakotan named Clint Hill, who by his own later account was not thrilled about it either. Guarding a first lady who wanted to be left alone seemed like a consolation prize compared to the excitement of presidential protection. That changed faster than either of them expected. Hill accompanied Jackie on official trips through India and Pakistan, long stretches away from Washington where the usual formality between a principal and her agent began to erode. He learned to read her moods before she voiced them, to run interference with photographers who pushed too close, and to anticipate the moments when the public performance of being a first lady became too much for her. Their relationship never crossed into anything improper. It was, by every credible account, a bond of trust built on proximity and repetition, the kind that forms between 2 people who share the same stressful hours year after year. Around the same time, a second agent, Paul Landis, joined the detail assigned to Caroline and John Jr., which put him inside the family's daily life in a way few outsiders ever experienced. He saw the arguments, the exhaustion, and the ordinary friction of a young family that magazine covers were built to hide. The strain on that family became unbearable in August 1963, when the Kennedys' newborn son, Patrick, died just 2 days after a premature birth. The agents who stood outside the hospital that week watched a grief that had nothing to do with performance, and it left a mark on the marriage that outside observers rarely acknowledge. By the time autumn arrived, the Secret Service was also tracking a rising current of hostility aimed at the president out of Texas, but the campaign schedule through Dallas went forward as planned. Standard precautions were taken. No one anticipated that 4 seconds in Dealey Plaza would rewrite the rest of the century. The shots that struck President Kennedy on November 22nd sent Clint Hill sprinting from the running board of the follow-up car before most bystanders had even registered what the sound meant. He reached the accelerating limousine just in time to see Jackie climbing onto the trunk, reaching for a fragment of her husband's skull in a moment of pure shock. Hill pushed her back into the seat and covered both her and the president with his own body as the car raced toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. Inside that same vehicle, Paul Landis noticed something else entirely, a nearly undamaged bullet resting in the seam of the back seat cushion. Fearing it would be lost, stolen, or contaminated in the chaos, he pocketed it, intending to hand it over properly once things settled down. Decades later, Landis would say he placed that bullet on a stretcher inside the hospital rather than turning it in through a documented chain of custody, an informal decision made in a moment of pure panic rather than any attempt at concealment. That single choice would end up mattering more to American history than he could have imagined. Inside Trauma Room 1, Jackie refused every request to leave, choosing instead to kneel on the floor near her dying husband as doctors worked. Hill and Landis stood as a wall between her and the swelling crowd of hospital staff and onlookers, protecting the last private moments she would have with him. After doctors pronounced the president dead, aides begged her to change out of her blood-stained suit. She refused, later telling those close to her that she wanted the world to see exactly what had been done to him. She wore that suit onto the plane back to Washington and stood in it beside Lyndon Johnson as he took the oath of office, a silent, devastating rebuke aimed at whoever was responsible. The public saw grace at the funeral. What Hill and Landis saw afterward in the years that followed was closer to collapse. Hill returned to his duties carrying an obsessive guilt, replaying those seconds in Dealey Plaza and convincing himself that a faster reaction on his part might have changed the outcome. He fell into depression, drank heavily, and eventually resigned from the Secret Service in 1975 after more than 15 years, telling interviewers that he could not shake the belief he had failed at the one job that mattered most. Landis carried his own version of that weight, made heavier by a detail almost no one knew. The Warren Commission investigating the assassination never actually interviewed him. His first-hand account of where that bullet was found and how it got from the limousine to the hospital never became part of the official record. For nearly 60 years, both men kept what they knew to themselves, turning down lucrative offers to tell their stories because they viewed the family's grief as something that did not belong to the public. That silence had consequences no one fully appreciated until Landis broke it. When he eventually described the bullet's true location, it complicated the foundation of the so-called single bullet theory, the explanation investigators used to account for the wounds suffered by both President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally with one round. If the bullet Landis recovered came to rest in the limousine seat rather than on Connally's stretcher, the neat trajectory investigators relied on becomes far harder to defend, and the tidy account of a lone gunman becomes considerably messier. It does not, on its own, prove a second shooter existed. It does show how much of the official history rested on assumptions that were never actually tested against everyone who was there. For Jackie herself, the aftermath was a private war that had little to do with theories about bullets. She left Washington for New York in 1964, but relocating did nothing to quiet what would, today, be recognized as textbook post-traumatic stress. She became convinced her children were still targets, flinched at loud noises, and lived with a wariness that never fully eased. Robert Kennedy's assassination in 1968 confirmed her worst fears and pushed her toward a decision that stunned the public: marrying Aristotle Onassis, a Greek shipping magnate old enough to be her father. It was widely mocked at the time as a mercenary and loveless match. Those close to the situation understood it differently. Onassis could offer something the United States government could not: private security on a fortified island, insulated from cameras and crowds, purchased with a fortune rather than granted by federal budget. Marrying him meant giving up her official Secret Service detail, a trade her longtime protectors watched with real sadness, even though the agency continued guarding her children until they turned 16. Isolation on Scorpios never fully delivered the peace she was chasing, but it gave her something closer to control. And for a woman who had lost so much of that on a Dallas street, control was worth almost any price. Her final decades brought her back to New York and to something resembling an ordinary life. She worked for years as a book editor, spending her days in the unglamorous business of manuscripts and deadlines rather than state dinners. In 1993, she was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and she faced it with the same restraint she had shown in public since 1963. She died at her Manhattan apartment in May 1994. Clint Hill remained protective of her privacy through all of it, shielding her from paparazzi during her illness, the way he had once shielded her from gunfire. Her death, more than anything else, seemed to loosen something in him. He began giving interviews and writing memoirs, often breaking down on camera as he described the weight he had carried since Dallas, finally allowing himself to grieve in public rather than alone. Clint Hill died in February 2025 at 93, the last surviving agent who had actually been on the presidential limousine that day. His passing, alongside Landis's decision to finally go on record about the bullet years earlier, forced historians to revisit an event most Americans assumed had been picked apart from every possible angle. It hadn't. An entire eyewitness account had simply never made it into the file. What both men's testimony ultimately reveals is less about conspiracy and more about the limits of any official investigation that leaves out the people who were actually standing closest to the truth. Strip away the myth of Camelot, and what remains is a far more human story. Jackie Kennedy was not simply a grieving widow who happened to carry herself well in public. She was a woman who understood almost immediately that how the tragedy looked would shape how it was remembered, and she managed that image with remarkable deliberation even while falling apart privately. The men who protected her for years and who chose silence over profit for decades afterward ultimately proved that the truest measure of loyalty isn't what you're willing to say. It's what you're willing to carry quietly for as long as it takes until you finally decide the person you were protecting no longer needs protecting from the truth. So the question worth sitting with isn't really about ballistics or bullet fragments. It's whether the country ever actually knew the woman behind the composure, or only the version of her she built for the cameras, while two loyal bodyguards quietly carried the rest. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.